You from the mountains and the plain. The only conservative voices brave enough to push back. This is the Conservative Daily Podcast with Joe Otto.
That's what the Second Amendment was designed to do. If you're going to do something to nullify or take away my rights under the Constitution, come get it.
Max McGuire.
When you look at politicians on the left, they need to convince people that they are victims.
A resistance to the resistance. And now your hosts, Joe Otto and Max McGuire.
And welcome back to another edition of the Conservative Daily Podcast. This is episode 99. We are quickly approaching episode number 100. As I said, my name is Max McGuire. Today, Joe Otto is out. Joe filled in for me when I was sick earlier this week, so I figured I'd return the favor and give him a day off as well. So just to get right into it, today we're going to be talking to a man named Pat Welsh, and he is a retired major in the Dayton, Ohio Police Department. He spent 26 years on the force, and nowadays he focuses time on his legal practice. He's a lawyer, as well as training police officers, today's officers, using the experiences that he learned on the job. So we're going to talk to him a bit today about the defund the police movement, about what that means, what that would mean for communities and police officers, the shooting in Atlanta and how police officers are now under fire for defending themselves, what that would mean for communities, and then talk a bit about what it would take to actually weed out bad cops, because you don't need to agree with the left to understand that there are bad people in the uniform. It's not everyone, the way the left claims. There are a select few. Talk about what it takes to weed those people out. So without further ado, I want to bring on and welcome to the show, Mr. Pat Welsh. Pat, how's it going?
Hey, Max, thank you. Doing great. Beautiful day here in the mountains of Colorado. So,
yeah, no, I envy you. Yeah, go ahead, keep
I
on.
just need to clarify one thing. I am not actively practicing. When I retired from law enforcement, I also went inactive, so I'm not actually practicing law,
Okay.
but I do teach for the University of Louisville. I teach legal issues in prosecuting homicide cases.
Okay. All right. Well, sorry about that. Sorry, I messed that up.
That's all right.
I want to jump right into it. And I know that it's impossible in the time we have available to us today to explain everything that happened in your 26 years as a police officer. But obviously, Dayton, Ohio, if people don't know that, historically has been a relatively violent city. They're, at least nowadays, consistently up there when it comes to cities with the highest violent crime rates, highest murder rates. I mean, it's a major city in the United States. You get that no matter what you do. Talk to us a little bit about your time on the force. Like, again, we'll never be able to get into all of it, but just talk a little bit about your experience as a police officer.
I did things a little backwards. I was actually a practicing assistant district attorney who became a cop. So I went from being in the courtroom prosecuting criminal cases to being in the courtroom testifying as a police officer. And I kept my license active and continued to practice law for that 26 years. I worked my way up. I went from 8 years in patrol, 7 years in patrol, a year in narcotics as a detective, got promoted to sergeant, went back into patrol as a sergeant, as a watch commander, and then took over narcotics as a commander, took over violent crimes as a commander. The homicide squad worked for me. And then I finished out the last year and a half, 2 years of my career as the superintendent of operations. And Dayton, you're right. At one time, we were the 7th most violent city per capita. When we were 7, Compton, California was 9. In 2018, per capita, Chicago was 23, Dayton, Ohio was 22. So yeah, I had 26 years on the killing streets, really, is what it came down to.
And what years specifically were you working in Dayton, Ohio?
1986 to 2012.
Okay. All right. So yeah, up until recently. So you've seen a couple of trends in law enforcement, right? You've been through there working narcotics with the war on drugs. You've seen that kind of start to go away as drugs become decriminalized or at least less criminalized. Did you notice a change in your policing towards the end as the politicians no longer backed that strong on crime, crack down on drugs mentality as they start to be more forgiving of that?
A lot of things happened in the Dayton region. It wasn't just the crime; it was economics. We went from 26 General Motor plants in the county to none, to zero, and they literally bulldozed a lot of the plants and turned them into parks. And well, now one area is a racetrack casino, and so we lost the economic tax base. And with the employment, we went from 226,000 people. I think when I first came on, we were ranked in the top 30 largest cities in the United States. To now, they're down in below 150,000. I think they're closer to 135,000. So the politics, the economics, everything changed policing. And I mentioned to you before we went on the air, in my 26 years, I had 8 police chiefs, and that included 2 acting chiefs. So there was everything about policing in the Dayton region changed dramatically, and its impact, hiring freezes, just all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't just one specific impact or influencer that changed policing, but a lot of things.
So you rose to a level of what you called one of the superintendents. So that put you more behind a desk than you would have been walking a beat, correct? Towards the end of your career.
Towards the end of my career, yeah. I was not a desk jockey. I got more commendations and award of merits and department citations as a commander and up than I did as a patrolman. I was very involved in the community, very active out on the street.
I didn't want it to come across as insulting calling you a desk jockey anymore. I just want to set the stage, because as you rise through those ranks, when you're no longer just a low-ranking beat cop, you start having to deal with more of the operations side of the department. So you have more experience than you would have in the early parts of your career with having to manage the budget that's given to you, having to deal with making sure that you don't go above that. And you mentioned that Dayton, Ohio, like much of the Rust Belt, went through a really hard time in those years, losing manufacturing, losing that tax base, combined with the fact of Democrats taking over control in a lot of these areas and imposing their own kinds of policies on it. Police departments were stretched more thin, right, during your time on the force. Did you notice that?
Absolutely. And I'll clarify for you, the city of Dayton has always been a Democrat-controlled entity. Now, the county was more Republican, but the city of Dayton has, the entire time I moved there in 1976, when I transferred to college to the University of Dayton, to today, it is a 100% Democrat-controlled political system within the city. So we did not have that roller coaster change in policies because of political parties. We just kept disintegrating.
It just went from bad to worse.
Economically, it did, and we had residency for most of my career. It was a condition of employment. You had to live in the city if you worked for the city. So that complicated for police officers. You never got away from it. You always carried your gun off duty because of you're going to run into somebody you arrested or sent to prison or whatever. And so you really did feel like you were on duty 24/7, even though you weren't. You felt like it because of residency. And eventually, the state stepped in and created a statute that did away with residency as a condition of employment. So
I could understand why that would be tougher in a place like Dayton, Ohio. One thing I have noticed is that I grew up in a small town in New Jersey, a town of 3,000 people. Everyone knew everyone. When I grew up, the police officer was married to one of the school teachers, right? Everyone knew everyone. You knew where people lived. You had a relationship. Even if you didn't know them personally, you would wave, you'd know their name. Just in my lifetime, I've seen a transition away from police departments being made up of their own to imported officers because they don't have enough people within the town or the city to fill those jobs. So I understand the challenge for someone like you having to live in Dayton, Ohio as part of your employment. But one of the problems I see today is that police departments, the ones that we see being caught up in the news today, are not being policed by the communities that are outraged. They're being policed by people who don't live there, don't know those people. Do you think that there's an element of that to it? Obviously, not discounting your experience, but do you think that one of the ways to fix what's going on in this country would be to relocalize police?
That's a Band-Aid solution to a deeper problem. And I understand what you're saying, and I would clarify this perspective. The lack of police-community relationships are most often felt in squads that work between 8 at night and 8 in the morning. Because the vast majority of people that are the leaders are the ones that you can talk to and have coffee. You can do that police community building. That's during the daytime. The businessmen and women, students, all those, and you get 8 at night to 8 in the morning. And after midnight, our experience was if you're out after midnight, you're probably up to no good to a certain degree.
Yeah.
So the cops that work those late, the graveyard, the late night shifts, they have more of that law enforcer mindset because they're running from call to call for service. The domestic violences, the robberies, the DUI crashes, all that kind of stuff. So their mindset is they're in that kind of high drive mode, and it's not about stopping and shooting hoops with some young kids at the park and interacting in a non-enforcement way. So
I can understand that.
Yeah, and whether you live locally or you commute into work, it doesn't change that kind of environment. I think there is something to be said for hiring from folks that live in your community. But like you say, if your community is small, and 135,000, 140,000 people is a small community to have, expect to have 350 cops, because that
it's tough.
For service, it gets tough. What we should really be doing is looking at our recruiting and hiring, and we're still asking questions in the hiring process that they were asking in 1950. The first one right out of the box is always, why do you want to be a police officer? That's a worthless question. It doesn't show us the values of that person. It doesn't show us the leadership potential of that person. We need to start getting into the 21st century of recruiting people with purpose, not recruiting people to have a live body sitting in a cruiser that can run to a call. So it's a complicated issue, but there are common sense answers.
Yeah, it's complicated. I completely understand. I do think that you can't expect every police officer to be local, but there is, and I think you agree, there is value not just in the police officer being able to shoot hoops, but the same officer that is coming to your house when there's a disturbance is the same officer that's holding traffic to make sure you can walk home safe from school, right? The same officer that's showing up as you're eating at the pizza place. There's definitely a benefit to being able to see that these people are part of the community, because that's what this is all supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about protecting the community, protecting and serving. And I agree that there's challenges. It's no perfect fit, and it wouldn't be an overnight fix either, because as you mentioned, the people who are local don't really want to be working the night shift anyway. But I do think that that's going to be a push that you're going to see, particularly from Democrats, to make policing more local, if they even allow police departments to exist at all. I want to talk about this defunding of the police, which is the rallying cry we're hearing now. There's a lot of different ways to interpret that. Defunding the police in Minnesota and Minneapolis, where they want to literally disband the police department. Defunding the police in terms of stopping them from acquiring certain weapons or certain equipment, or actually cutting their budget so much that they have no choice but to reduce the number of officers on the job. Do you think it's possible to defund the police in any way, any of those different scenarios, and that communities would be safer as a result?
Absolutely not, because what New York just yesterday? I believe New York, they announced they're cutting $1 billion off NYPD's budget and redirect that funding to social services or others. So it's not like they're saving $1 billion or defunding to them is redirecting. Okay, well, that $1 billion, look at the budgets of the average police department. I was on a podcast last night with the police chief of Forest Park, Illinois, outside of Chicago. 22,000 residents, and over 90% of his budget, this is typical of every police department in the country, over 90% of his budget is personnel cost. It's not bells and whistles, It's not training, it's not assets that you could go, well, you don't need that cruiser or you don't need that item. It's personnel cost, wages, benefits, everything that goes into that, contributions to the pension board. So if you cut a major part or any part of a defunding pathway, it is necessarily going to have to result in fewer police officers. It has to, because 90% of the budget. Ours in Dayton was closer to 92 to 94%. And I was a contract negotiator. I was seeing the numbers. I was responsible for a $9 million budget, and it was 96% of my budget was personnel costs. So when you start talking defunding, you have to understand what the impact is going to be, and it's going to be in personnel. So
a lot of people think that when they see the new cruisers, when they see the flashy new gear, or even when they see the MRAPs, I'm sure that you got some of those when you were in Dayton towards the end of your career, the mine-resistant anti-personnel vehicles. Basically, they came from the Pentagon. A lot of departments have them. They're free. A lot of the equipment that departments rely on comes from that 1033 program with the Pentagon, where when federal departments and agencies and the military itself have surplus equipment, instead of destroying it, it's given to police departments. So that would include bulletproof vests. It would include riot gear, riot shields, batons, rifles, pistols, grenade launchers. That usually makes people a little uneasy, but the grenade launchers aren't used to fire grenades at people. They're usually used for flashbangs or tear gas. And then these MRAPs, these big SWAT, they almost look like tanks. So a lot of the time when you hear defund the police, they're also talking about cutting off that program, which would eliminate a department's ability to get this low cost, because they get it for pennies on the dollar. If they want to actually buy this stuff, they never would have been able to afford it. Did you have any experience with those programs? I know that most departments did receive at least some equipment from the federal government. Did you have any experience with that 1033 program?
No, that was ramping up about the time I retired. We had the SWAT team was the only team that had a armored vehicle, and eventually they had a smaller one. They eventually got a bigger one. 100% of that was funded through asset seizure and forfeiture. We didn't get anything free. And then it had a very, very specific purpose with the SWAT team and the hostage negotiation team and high-risk call-outs, high-risk execution search warrants. It wasn't used for crowd control. It was very, very limited use, and we paid for it. Our weapons, we worked out deals of trade-ins to upgrade from 9mm to, well, when I came home and carried 38s, I had to buy my first vest out of my own pocket, 1986, $400 out of my pocket to buy a vest so I could be protected. The department didn't issue those. We got 38 revolvers. We eventually went to the 9mm Glock. And when we went to the 40 caliber, we worked out a deal with Glock on a trade-in.
Yeah.
So we weren't getting the financial gimmies that some other agencies, typically larger agencies, and we were a 520-man department, which is a big department by standards. So, and then the 1033, that was just starting to ramp up when I retired.
Yeah, I was looking at it just as you were talking, and as of I think a year or two ago, if you added up all Ohio agencies, they had accumulated 65,000 total items, whether that's rifles, scopes, night vision goggles, glow sticks, batons, shields, all across. I'm seeing community colleges getting rifles. Central State University got 5 M14s from the program. So it does look that it was ramping up towards the towards the beginning of the Obama administration, 2008, 2009. But it does seem today that it's significant, especially for small town police forces, because as you mentioned, Dayton, big police force. But when you look at like a smaller town, and when we see what's going on in the country today, where most small towns don't have riot squad, right? They don't have a riot team. They don't have a special ops team. They just have the 10 officers that they have. And if a riot breaks out in their town, they don't have the money in the budget to buy that equipment that Dayton might. So they rely on this program more heavily because it's a worst case scenario kind of thing. Like, God forbid a riot ever happens in this small town. We need to have it. So they have it. It's collecting dust. To take that away, from what I've read, would be devastating to local police. Because not only would they not have the gear, they don't have the tax revenues to replace it.
Right. And those are the departments that can't even afford to buy their troops bulletproof vests because their budgets are so limited, their resources. And people, go, if their mindset is, well, we're a small community of 20,000 or 10,000 or 3,000. We'll never have a riot here. You got another thought coming because you're not paying attention to what's going on. I'm telling you, I'm a cradle Catholic. I mean, I was born in Dublin, Ireland. I'm as Irish Catholic as you can get, and a practicing Catholic. And when Sean King opens his mouth the other day and says, demands that the white Jesus statues and all stained glass and all that, we're coming after that. Well, you know what? That little small town Catholic church or that little small town evangelical, whatever, you now have a target on you.
Yeah.
And I don't care how big or how small you are, and your police department needs to be ready to step up and defend you.
Yeah,
and there's statutes left and right.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to just take this time to mention to our audience, please do hit the share button. Facebook is throttling us again today because we're talking about police issues. They don't want people to see this. So if you like this conversation, and it's going to keep going, if you like it and you want more people to hear what we're talking about, make sure you hit that share button. Help us get around Facebook's algorithm. I was going to talk about this later, but now that we're talking about kind of funding and all that, I want to talk a bit about qualified immunity. Qualified immunity is the idea that if you are a government official doing your job in your official capacity, if you do something wrong or hurt someone, you can't be sued as an individual. You're sued in your capacity as an officer. One of the parts of that Democrats want to defund the police is to get rid of qualified immunity, so that if a police officer makes a mistake on the job, instead of the victim suing the department, the victim would be able to sue the officer directly. And if he lost the civil suit, he'd lose his house, he'd lose his life savings, his kid's college fund. It's insane. And what we're hearing from Democrats is that police officers should carry the same kind of malpractice insurance that surgeons carry. In your time on the force, do you think that any of the officers you work with would have had the kind of income coming in to pay for malpractice insurance?
Absolutely not. And let me clear up the misconception of qualified immunity that is floating around generally. Qualified immunity is not diplomatic immunity. It's not the same. People, you see the movies where, well, you can't arrest me because I have diplomatic immunity. That's not qualified immunity. And qualified immunity, first of all, it's not automatic. I'll give you an example. I got sued in federal court in the between 94 and 99. It was around 1998. I got sued in federal court and I was a sergeant, along with an officer and a homicide detective. And I got sued for false arrest. So I'm going to say it's 1998. So this is 22 years ago. As I sit here talking to you, I have never personally ever even seen the guy that sued me, let alone arrested. I have never seen him. And I made the broadcast. He took a axe handle, no axe head, took an axe handle, a white guy, and beat the tar out of what we believed, because he gave us a birth date that made him 18, a 18-year-old black male. Beat him with an axe handle. And then he fled the scene in a 1976 tan Volare with red fog lights. There's only one of those in Dayton, Ohio, and it was his. So we had witnesses step forward, and I made the broadcast on the radio for this guy, and we had the guy's name. I even went to his apartment.
And you had reasonable suspicion that it was him, given the fact you had the description, and you know there was
I had probable cause. And there was a note on his apartment door. Tony, don't come home. The police are looking for you. So I made the broadcast. And several hours later, another sergeant spotted the car, stopped it. It was our named suspect, bloody axe handle in the back seat, and he made the arrest. We ordered our victim, our policy, he was taken to the hospital, and we gave him an order in to the detective section the next morning to swear out the complaint. He never showed up. Never showed up. In fact, he lied about his identity. We found out we never could find him again. He gave us a bogus name, a date of birth. And 30 minutes before the statute of limitations expired, 2 years later, 3 of us got sued. And it wasn't the actual sergeant that arrested him. If I didn't have qualified immunity, then yes, and I was sued personally, and I was sued in my official capacity in federal court for 1983 action. And the judge eventually dismissed it, but he granted all 3 of us qualified immunity because this is what qualified immunity is. In the performance of your official duties as a government employee, the police, you acted in good faith.
Yeah.
And now we are saying, hey, by the way, you were wrong. And that it's not settled law, but we're saying, like Tennessee versus Garner, there's case law. It's years and years of case law saying this is not a pass that you can't be sued. We're just saying that you acted in good faith. That's what qualified immunity is. But it just so happens, in hindsight, we legally think you were wrong. So, but we're not going to punish you personally, but you still are on the hook with the municipality and the police department to be sued in your official capacity as a police officer.
Yeah, which is where I think a lot of the challenges. You hear people say qualified immunity, and they act like the first word in that phrase isn't qualified, right? The fact that you have to qualify for the immunity by being in your official capacity, and as you mentioned, making a good faith effort to do your job, It doesn't cover you. It doesn't cover an officer committing a crime simply because he's wearing a uniform and has his badge on, right? It doesn't work that way.
No.
It's your official duties, and you have to be making a good faith effort. I agree that that's something that really gets left behind. But the way that it's funny when you hear the way Democrats describe it, they say that police officers and Teresa Roth is writing into our YouTube feed that the malpractice insurance deserves looking into. I disagree, because the way you hear Democrats when they're proposing this, what they're saying is that if the officers can't afford the malpractice insurance, then the department should pay for it themselves. Well, how is that any different than the department being sued and the city defending itself, right? Saying that you have to pay for insurance, it seems silly when if you sue the city, you're not gonna fail to collect, right? If you sue a police department like Dayton, and you win, you are going to collect. You don't need insurance to guarantee you can collect. You need insurance for people who might not be able to pay out. It seems like this is just an attempt to make it more complicated, so that instead of you suing the department and going to court against the city or the state, bringing insurance into it. Now, that would be a nightmare, because no such insurance like that exists right now. There would absolutely be a time period where, no matter how you slice it, if this kind of proposal passed, there would be a time period in between when officers and departments would get the insurance where they'd be extremely vulnerable. And you'd have police officers sued for, like in your case, doing nothing wrong, having all the justifications on your side. I worry that if this passes, we talk about wanting to make sure that at least some part of the police force is in the community. You also want a police force to be very diverse. Not just racially, not just ethnically or religiously, but also in terms of income, right? You want police officers from all walks of life, because it creates more room for empathy, especially when it comes to socioeconomic lower classes, being able to empathize with the people that you're policing. I worry that if something like this passes, that you will not be able to have lower income and lower middle class income people become police officers, because they just won't be able to afford it. No one should have to worry about bankruptcy when signing up to protect and serve. Do you think that I'm onto anything? Do you think that that's a risk if something like this was to happen, that we'd see less low income and middle class people signing up?
Oh, yes. And then here's, I spent 30 years practicing law. Insurance is not a guarantee of anything, because insurance companies, the old adage, collect premiums and deny claims. You will never get insurance from no insurance company in their right mind is going to insure a police officer. And what we're talking about, qualified immunity, is that you're personally on the hook and you get charged criminally for what you're being sued for. So excessive use of force.
Yeah.
Take Atlanta. You take Minneapolis. Those officers civilly are going to be sued for excessive use of force. And that excessive use of force for all four of them has also resulted in criminal charges. There's going to be a little clause in your insurance policy that says this policy does not cover intentional illegal conduct. So the insurance company is going to go, nah, we're not indemnifying you, and you have to sue your insurance company. So insurance is this false idea of some absolute protection of financial protection, and it's not.
Yeah.
They're gonna. We went through the Waldo Canyon fire here in Colorado back in 2012. At that time, the worst wildfire in the history of Colorado. 138 homes within a 1 mile radius of my house burned to the ground. My house suffered $218,000 in damage. The insurance company offered us $51,000. And when I said that's not right, they invoked arbitration and made me, it took us a year to go to arbitration, have a hearing, and win what they should have covered us for from the get-go. So having insurance is a false sense of security. And here's the other thing about qualified immunity. They're only abolishing qualified immunity for police officers, not waste management, not traffic control. No other employee within that municipality or sheriff's department loses their qualified immunity. And then here in Colorado, their law exempts state law enforcement. So you're telling the local and county police law enforcement, you have to wear body cameras, you don't have qualified immunity. Hey, but if you work for the state and you're a state trooper or Colorado Bureau of Investigation, whatever enforcement, breathe easy, guys, we're taking care of you. So that shows the hypocrisy and the lack of logic in what they're trying to convince people of. This is a gotcha, and we're paying back because we're in control.
Well, yeah, they're counting on people. They're counting on people not looking into the specifics. People hear insurance. Police officers should have to carry insurance, and like, oh, that sounds great. But you're absolutely right. With insurance policies, they will not pay out if a crime has been committed. If someone puts a meth lab in their basement and burns their house down, they shouldn't expect homeowners insurance to make them whole again, right? You're absolutely right that they will make whatever argument they can to not pay out, especially if you're under some kind of criminal investigation. You mentioned Atlanta, and there's so many problems with what's happening in Atlanta. I look at it, and from the use of force perspective, I want to get your perspective on this, and we'll play the clip. We'll play the CCTV clip. From my perspective, it looks like a legitimate use of police force. The officer had a taser fired at him, which in Georgia is a deadly weapon by law. The taser was fired at him; it missed. But the way the prosecutor is saying that the police officer should have done trigonometry in pitch black darkness and figured out where those taser barbs were going to land, and he should have known the angle, right? And he should have done all that math equation in his head to figure out that he was not under any threat. But from a layman's view, it looked like it was a pretty simple incident. Tragic. Anytime someone loses their life, it's tragic. But he was fired upon, and he returned fire. I want to play the clip for everyone watching, and then I want to get your opinion on it. So let's go, Josh. Let's go to cut one. And that is the moment you can see where he's firing right as he crosses over in front of that red car. You see that little puff of smoke as he's firing that taser. I'll say it again. You know this as a police officer, but everyone watching, when you fire a taser, it's not just the barbs with the wires that come out. Tasers, at least taser brand tasers, also fire little bits of confetti. And on that confetti is a little serial number that identifies the taser that was fired. So if an officer fires a taser, all that confetti blows everywhere, and it's impossible to pick it all up and hide the fact that you fired the taser. So we see in that video that Rayshard Brooks fired the taser at the officer. That's a deadly weapon. I know you're not a lawyer in Georgia, but the law in Georgia says it's a deadly weapon.
No, I researched it. I did. I researched the law, and you're absolutely
Am I off base at all? Am I?
No. And not only do you have the confetti, the technology in the taser records everything. You can't go, oh, I didn't fire my taser. No, we just download your taser, and we get exactly what time it happened, how long if you drive stun somebody, how many seconds. If you go, oh, I only drive stunned them, used it as a stun gun, not the projectiles.
Mm-hmm.
I only did it once. Well, no, you did it 3 times. So you can't lie and beat the taser. That's one thing. For this specific incident, yes, the taser in Georgia by statute is considered a firearm. And so it qualified. Because there is a cop sitting in prison in Georgia who tased somebody, and it resulted in death. So Georgia says a taser qualifies as a deadly weapon.
There's also a cop just in the last couple weeks who is being prosecuted simply for pointing a taser at a protester. He's being prosecuted for brandishing the weapon. So you're right. Keep going.
Right, and several weeks before this incident, the same DA goes after two cops with the college students, and use the argument this is no different than pointing your pistol at them. So you got a guy talking out of both sides of his mouth, from a legal perception, and the settled law from the Supreme Court of the United States has been, for a very, very long time, been this of when you can use deadly force. An officer is authorized to use deadly force when it is objectively reasonable under the totality of the circumstances, when one or both of the following apply: protect the officer or others from what is reasonably believed to be an immediate threat of death or serious bodily injury, and to prevent the escape of a fleeing subject when the officer has probable cause to believe that the person has committed or intends to commit a felony involving serious bodily injury or death, and the officer reasonably believes there's an imminent risk of serious bodily injury or death to the officer or another, if he's not.
Which both apply in this situation.
And by law, and as I understand it, law enforcement tasers now, when I first came on, you got one cartridge and you had to reload. They now, law enforcement are issued, it's like a double-barrel shotgun. You have two cartridges. So it's not, oh, he shot and now he can't shoot again, fire another cartridge. And not the way I understand it, no, they were issued the double cartridge tasers.
Yes, they were, and that's one of they were issued the double barreled, for lack of a better term. They were issued that 2-magazine taser, and one of the arguments that the DA in this case is making is that when that shot that we saw, when Rayshard Brooks fired the taser at the officer, that was the second shot from that taser, and that the officer should have known that. That was actually what the DA said in his press conference, that the officer should have known that the magazine was empty and that it had already been fired twice and couldn't be used again. Now, first of all, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that once it's fired, it can still be used as a regular stun gun, even after it's been fired. But second of all, in the heat of the moment, when you've attempted to arrest someone, they've attacked you, brought you to the ground, hit you, have run away from you, fled the scene, turned back and fired a weapon at you. I talk about the psychology of what goes through an officer's head in that moment. Because for me, there's only been 2 times in my life I've ever had to draw my weapon. I've never had to fire my concealed handgun. I've had to draw it twice, and both was late at night at a gas station where there were people creeping up on me, and I just told them to get lost, right? But a lot of people think that in that moment, time slows down. It really doesn't. You're forced to make life or death decisions in a split second. It's not slow motion like you see in the movies. Talk to me about what's going through an officer's head in those kinds of circumstances where they were just fired upon. Is it reasonable for an officer to be counting shots like that? I mean, you see it in the movies, but I don't believe it's reasonable. Is it reasonable to expect the officer to know how many shots would be left in the taser?
No, and it's not just that he assaulted the officers and took off running. There's an armed robbery, because if that was it's a firearm, he didn't just steal a taser. He stole a firearm. That makes it an armed robbery in Georgia, in Ohio, and the assault was a felony assault. The fleeing was a crime. So he actually committed 4, 5, 6 possible 6 crimes.
Yeah. We went through, and there was like 10. There were 10 crimes that he committed. Yeah.
And then he turns. Again, this is all, in 6 seconds or so. How did the officer for sure know when he turned over his shoulder? Everybody goes, well, he was shooting a taser. How did the officer know that? How did the officer not know that he didn't actually pitch the taser and that pulled a gun? And what we do is what cops do from training and from experience is you rapidly process information, and then you go into muscle memory. You revert to how you were trained. You will fight the way you were taught to fight. And when somebody points a gun at you in shoot, don't shoot scenarios, what we're trying to do is to get officers to rapidly process information to make a right decision. And in this case, it wasn't just that the guy pointed a weapon at him. He pulled the trigger.
He fired it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so and the officer did, and I have gotten this from, there is a possibility in trial, if this ever gets that far, there is a possibility that the officer was actually struck by one of the probes in the hand that he had his taser in, and he dropped the taser, and then he went and got his gun. I would wait to see when the evidence comes out, if it ever does. Everybody's assuming, hey, you got missed. We don't know.
Yeah, we don't know.
I've heard it. I know some people down in Atlanta, and it's been alleged to me, oh no, one of the probes actually struck him.
That'd be incredible.
I don't have to be, if you point a gun at me, I don't have to wait for you to shoot and see if you hit me before I can defend myself and stop you. So
this isn't the board game Battleship. You don't get alternating turns. And the minute he pulled that trigger, he exhibited a willingness to if that weapon against other people, not just against the cop. If the cop was to let him get away, how do you know that he wouldn't have used that taser, even if it's out of rounds? He might have used it as a stun gun to carjack someone, right, to get away. The possibilities of what he could have done if the officer let him get away are endless. To argue that, as the DA did, that he should just let it go, that, he was just a drunk guy who was asleep in his car, and he was passed out drunk in a drive-through lane. You should just let him go. He would have been fine. You can't do that as a cop, though, because he's already proven he's willing to shoot the cop.
And I'm sorry for laughing, but I'm not laughing at what you're saying, is the irony and the hypocrisy of going, in essence, what that guy just did, he has qualified immunity, you should let him go. Whereas that you're saying to the police officer, hey, you always have to do the right thing every single time. You can never be wrong. And if you make a mistake, then we're going to drop the hammer on you. But hey, this guy, he shot at you, but he missed you. And it's not that big a deal, and just let him go. So he's got immunity, is what you're telling me.
Yeah.
And
now, if he had tossed the taser away, put his hands up, or laid down on the ground, and said, "No, that was a big mistake. I give up." You can't shoot him in the back then. But if he's still holding the taser and running, even the slightest look over his shoulder, right? Even if you interpreted that, you could think that another shot is coming your way. And just because a taser is less than lethal doesn't mean that if he actually got the shot on the officer falls down, starts convulsing, and all of a sudden that suspect now has access to that officer's duty sidearm because he's on the ground shaking as the current's running through him. Let alone the fact that a taser can kill people. Just immobilizing the officer would give him access to an actual lethal handgun. So I look at this and it just seems so political, because whether he's an officer or whether he's a civilian, if someone takes a shot at you and you have reason to believe that he could shoot you or someone else, you have every right to neutralize that suspect. And it's tragic. It's absolutely tragic that he lost his life. But as you mentioned, he did 10, 12 things where if he had done even just something slightly differently, he'd still be alive today. To pin this on the officer and then to charge the officer for also kicking him when he was down, to charge the officer for standing on his arm to make sure he didn't grab a weapon. It's so unbelievably political. It makes me sick to my stomach. And I want to ask you, because we saw the walkout in Atlanta where police officers the next day, or that very day after the charges came down, refused to go in for work, or they called out sick, and we ran it on our channel, the dispatch radio, it was dead silence for 2 hours. And the things that did come across the radio were being handed off to Georgia State Police. Dead silence. Talk to this a bit as a police officer. Can you imagine, we talked about someone not wanting to be on the force potentially because they couldn't be able to afford the lawsuit and what that would weed out. Good qualified people that would be discouraged by that. Talk a bit about whether it seems ridiculous that officers would now be told if you defend yourself on duty, you'd face the death penalty, because that's what is on the table with this guy. They've kept the death penalty on the table. How can you expect any officer to do their job if by defending themselves, they're opened up to being put to death? Can you imagine any officer wanting to work under those kind of circumstances?
No. And I'm glad I don't have to make that choice. I'm glad I'm retired. And quite frankly, I would not recommend to anybody applying for a job in a jurisdiction that treats their law enforcement the way these folks are being treated. And understand this, that I spent better part of 6 years as an expert witness after I retired. Better part of 6 years as an expert witness in police use of force cases in multiple states. And every case that I took, it was months of me spending time reviewing everything that was accumulated in the investigation. Dispatch tapes, personnel records, policies, procedures, interview witnesses, everything. I would get boxes mailed to me of evidence and documents and whatnot. And it would take me months to come to a legal opinion as an expert on yay or nay, up or down, was this excessive use of force or wasn't? And for a DA, well, first of all, for a mayor to demand somebody to be fired within 24 hours off of that video is
shameful.
Is fundamentally, it's illegal. It is not. When you become a cop, you do not give up your right to due process. You do not give up your constitutional rights. And our police officers have to be treated fundamentally fair, because that's what due process is. And that's what 14th Amendment, due process. It's you're required to. There's no waiver of your rights when you put on a badge and uniform. So for what the mayor did was unconscionable, and then for the DA to charge these officers, not indict them. He charged them. He doesn't even have the evidence. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation has everything at their offices, and they're not done with their investigation. That is malpractice. That is malicious prosecution. And you know what? His qualified immunity that he thinks he might have to not be sued by these officers for having their constitutional rights just trampled. I think he better have good insurance. This whole process was it was vindictive, and it's on the verge of being illegal. And I think there are certainly civil liability consequences for the mayor and the police chief for how they handle the front end of this. And then to openly lie in your press conference that the non-shooting officer has already agreed to testify against his partner, that is an outright lie. This poor guy's, he's not going to be able to get a fair trial. If you poison the well with false facts, and you're a government official, that makes you liable. And it's sad because it was totally unnecessary.
Yeah.
So,
As we wrap up, because we're getting towards the end of the show, I want you to talk a little bit about the training that you do currently. I looked and I saw that your two books, Warrior Servant Leader, Life Behind the Badge, and then Warrior Servant Leader, Life Behind the Cross. I was looking a bit at the training website that you gave us, and I see those three words pop up again: Warrior Servant Leader. And I want you to talk a bit about that, because from what I was reading, it seems like an excellent kind of course to have police officers go towards, because yes, they're warriors, and police officers understand that, but they're also servants, and they also need to have those same leadership skills. So talk a little bit about the training that you do and why those three words, warrior, servant, leader, are so important.
Thank you, Ed. And let me define my terms. A warrior is a person that stands up, shows up, and defends what they believe. I don't know if you're married, have kids, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
but
all the above.
Yeah. So you're a warrior in your family. You stand up, show up, and you will defend your family. And I don't mean defend them with firearms. You will defend their reputation. You will defend health. You will do all those things, and that makes you a warrior. A servant is a person who puts the wants and needs of others before their own. And literally, that's what a servant is. They put the wants and needs of others before themselves. And a leader is a person who impacts and influences the lives of others. So when I say warrior, servant, leader, that's what I'm talking about. Take it completely out of law enforcement. In my lifetime, the greatest example in my lifetime of a warrior, servant, and leader was Mother Teresa of Calcutta, now St. Teresa of Calcutta. She displayed every one of those. She got up in front of the UN and gave them a tongue lashing on certain topics. And she stood up, showed up, and defended her faith and her belief in mankind and her mission and vision. She put the wants and needs of others. She did not have to live in Calcutta. She did not have to do what she did. And she was a tremendous person of influence and impact. So she's a warrior, servant, leader. What my training is I take it in a very holistic fashion for law enforcement, military and civilian, and I go in and take them through a progression of what that looks like. Because you know what? If you are loving, caring, compassionate, and empathetic at home, and you come to work and you're an asshole, and you treat people, disrespect people, and do all these things that are just like, who are you? That's not who you are at home. You need professional help. So, you can't be loving, kind, and compassionate and empathetic when you're out of uniform, and a total jerk when you're in uniform. So I make it a holistic approach. And one of the best feedback I ever got in writing from one of my trainings, I was training military security forces in the Air Force. And I'm pretty sure it was a lady. It was a non-commissioned officer, because that was the rank of the group I was talking to on that particular day. And she had real nice handwriting. So I'm guessing it was a lady. Here was her evaluation. You have given me the tools to help save my marriage. So my training isn't about making you a better cop. My training is to get you to intentionally live your life with those three mindsets. And at home, in the community, on the job, if you're a person of faith, in that arena, the second book, The Warrior Servant Leader, Life Behind the Badge, that kind of, it's a fun book and a way to read. There's some funny stuff in it. There's some very, very serious stuff. But it was a look behind psychology in my experience as a cop. The other one is my faith journey. I was abandoned in an orphanage when I was 3 days old in Dublin, Ireland. That's how my journey in this life started. And I've been through some tremendous dark times, personally and professionally. And so the book talks about that from a faith-based standpoint. that what has helped me get to that is having that warrior, servant, leader mindset and living intentionally. And so I don't want to get. Here's the bottom line. This is my guiding motto, and it's on my challenge coin. I made our youngest son when he was 12. I made him write it down and put it on the door, his bedroom door, and the refrigerator door, because he's going to see those two doors every day. I know. And this is my rule. Do the right thing at the right time, the right way, and for the right reasons. It's that simple.
Yeah.
If you intentionally live your life that way, those four things, you're good. And then from a faith-based standpoint, my guiding principle in conjunction with doing the right thing, right time, right way, and for the right reasons is love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul and energy. And if you do that, you're still going to have bad days, but you're going to be such a better person, personally and professionally. And so that's what my training is about. I come in and train cops.
Yeah.
And I try to
we included the link. We include the link to that training in the description if anyone wants to go and look at it. It sounds like it's really, really great stuff. It sounds like it'd be very rehabilitative. And even if cops go into it, it's good cops, right? It seems like this would only make them better. So we included that link in the description as well as the titles for your books. Thank you so much for coming on today. It was a really interesting discussion. I definitely want to have you back on as more of this stuff kind of develops. But thank you again. And again, anyone who wants to look up his books, we put the titles in the description as well as the link to Pat's website. So thank you again for coming on. That's going to be it for this edition of the Conservative Daily Podcast. If you want to download the podcast on an iPhone, make sure you go to the Apple Podcasts website, as well as you can go to Google Play Store if you have an Android. You can also find us on the Podbean app, as well as conservative-daily.com/podcast. We have a bunch of links in our description of our Facebook live stream and YouTube streams. Definitely click those links and sign up for our newsletter and different parts of our community. This is a podcast, but we have other aspects of our movement that we want you to join and become a part of as well. So definitely check out those links. So again, my name is Max McGuire. Joe Otto's off, but he's going to be back on Monday. So we'll have something fiery to talk about then. But until then, remember that the fight to take back our country is not over, but the only way we win is if we all stand and fight together.